To install your internal bearing crankset, you're going to need some waterproof grease, a large adjustable wrench, Allen keys, a torque wrench, an Allen key bit for the torque wrench, as well as a crank puller. The first thing you want to do before removing your crank arms is to quickly remove the pedals from your bike. Now you're going to need to remove the fixing screw. This is done using an Allen key. After you turn out the bolt here, it just takes a few rotations. Now, once the fixing bolt's removed, you can see what type of spindle you have. On this bike, it's a square tapered spindle. There's also ISIS and Octadrive spindles. The general procedure is the same. You will just need a different type of crank puller. The crank puller we're using is this model here, which has an adjustable tip. This smaller tip is for square taper bottom brackets, and this larger tip is for non-square taper bottom brackets that are internal bearings. Now you're going to take your crank puller and thread it into the threads of the crank arm. Snug this up with a wrench. The next step is to tighten the crank puller. This will either be done with a wrench or a shaft attached to the crank puller. Turning this clockwise, you're going to begin to pull the crank off this way by forcing it. It may take a little bit of work. Now you've removed your one crank arm. You just need to do the same thing on the opposite side, first removing your chain. Now before you put on the crank arm, I just like to put a little bit of grease to make sure to get into all these grooves inside of the spindle. You can install your crank arm. Take your fixing bolt, making sure to apply a liberal amount of grease to the threads. Now you can insert the bolt and start to tighten it with an Allen key. After it snugs up, you want to torque this to 35 to 50 Newton meters. To install the other crank arm, go through the same process. Just make sure you line them up in opposite directions. In this video, we showed you how to install a square taper crankset. If you're installing a crankset that fits onto an internal bearing bottom bracket that is not a square taper, you're going to have to pay attention to how the spindles line up when you're installing the cranks.